And welcome to the University of Illinois Extension's Local Government Education webinar. I'm Kathy Brown, and I'm with the University of Illinois Extension Community and Economic Development team. Today's program is the first in a series of programs for 2017. This series, developed by our local government education group, is continuing a focus on the government's role in economic development. I want to first mention that we are muting your phones during the presentation and encourage you that if you have problems or if you have questions during the presentation to use the chat space to share your thoughts or comments that you might have during the presentation. And the speakers will be responding to your questions at the end of both presentations. Now for today's webinar, we have Derek Price with Ansel Glink and Chris Markland from the National Association of Counties, who will be providing a review of 2016 legislation and a look forward into what we might expect to see in 2017. At this time, I'll introduce Derek and provide additional background on Chris Markland a little later in our presentation. Derek represents municipalities, park districts, school districts, townships, and libraries in his practice. And his practice includes appeals and trial works in both federal and state courts. He is concentrated in construction, land use and development, and environmental matters. Derek frequently speaks at local government conferences on land use and construction law issues, and his speaking engagements include the Illinois Municipal League Conference and others. We'll begin our legislative update with Derek taking over as the presenter. Derek?
Thanks very much. And I think I've now successfully taken over as the presenter. So, if 2015 was the year of, in terms of the work they did for down in Springfield for local government, 2015 was a year that was focused on a number of different problems: law enforcement, the workplace, and units of local government consolidating. And the 2016 year, which we're reviewing now, that's effective for us going forward here in 2017, is no different. And so I'm going to start with, hello? I'm going to start with new laws for law enforcement. And again, 2015 was the year of laws about surveillance, body cameras, videotaping. They amended when you can record police officers and how you interact with them. And in addition to all of that, concealed carry. Well, the laws that were passed 2016, effective in 2017, have affectionately become known as the laws about docs with Glocks. It's been turning, as a policy matter, police departments, law enforcement into traveling ambulances and medical personnel. The remedy is, if we're not going to spend money on health care, mental health, and some other things, these become police issues. This happened in Illinois in the 70s. I was an intern down in Springfield working for my state representative. That's when Thompson was closing all of the mental health facilities in the state. And so all of those folks were back out on the street and became a policing issue. So what is old is new again, only now in addition to mental health, it includes some of the things we're able to remedy out there in terms of physical problems. So the first one that's important is the EpiPen legislation, as it's known. It allows, effective January 1st, it authorizes local law enforcement to carry EpiPens. This, of course, is a result of the death of a young girl in a school where they didn't have an EpiPen to help her with an allergic reaction. So the first legislation was to make it mandatory for schools. The next step has been to authorize all of our law enforcement agencies to carry EpiPens once people are properly trained. Now, it's up to the state police to come up with the standards and the training, and they haven't done that yet. But once they have, then our law enforcement officers are while not mandatory in this sense yet, are going to be expected to get the training and to carry the EpiPens. Complicating matters for units of municipal government is the fact that EpiPens are not inexpensive, and they do have expiration dates. So in addition to getting your law enforcement officers trained and getting them to carry the inventory in their vehicles, it also has to then be monitored and replaced as appropriate as the medication expires. So we've shifted another burden to police officers. They're going to be expected to carry them. They get protection for carrying them if they're trained. So they've expanded the liability protection, except for willful and wanton. That would be, though, given what we lawyers do, willful and wanton might be using expired EpiPens or failing to have them. It's going to be a question as to whether this permissive legislation becomes a mandatory duty. Like, for example, you could have saved someone's life. You didn't have an EpiPen because you chose not to. What then? What is the liability then? So I think most of us will default to having these things and having to pay for them. Likewise, although not entirely new legislation, the Springfield also expanded the list of law enforcement officers who now mandatorily must carry Narcan. Before, it was a very detailed list, essentially law enforcement officers in the most traditional sense. Now it's been expanded to include forest preserve police, for example, for those of you in the counties. It includes park district police for the half dozen or so park districts in the state of Illinois that have their own police departments. And it includes anybody who is subject to the line of duty statute. And the line of duty statute, which helps define who is a police officer, no court ever interpreting that statute has ever narrowed its scope. So it's a mandatory scope, and the scope seems to increase. And that's one where there is a real danger of someone whose life could have been saved by an injection of Narcan, and a police officer, say a Forest Preserve police officer, wasn't carrying the Narcan as is mandated by this. This isn't permissive. This is mandatory. Well, you had a duty to carry Narcan. You failed that duty, and now there certainly will be liability. So one of the issues now going forward is you got to double check if you've got any kind of police force, law enforcement force, where the officer might be under the line of duty statute, because now you have to carry Narcan. And as I mentioned with the EpiPens, they have an expiration date. Narcan's even worse. One, Narcan's more expensive, and by the time you get it, that only has a shelf life of 4 months. It has a shelf life of actually 6 months, but by the time you order it and get it from the pharmacy, you're down to about 4 months that you could have it in the police squad. So 3 times a year, you're going to have to refresh your Narcan inventory. Again, shifting another burden to local municipalities already strained on their budgets. Thank you, Springfield. In addition to administering medications, we're now in the business of collecting them. So that they amended the disposal of medications effective January 1, 2017, so that medications found at a crime scene, whether it's a death, a drug overdose, those kinds of things, there are now rules and regulations around how you dispose of medications, how you collect them, how you photograph them, inventory them, what you do with them, and where they go. The Chiefs of Police Association has been working very hard to train people about that and get it done right, because you can imagine the field day criminal defense lawyers will have if you haven't followed the policies and procedures correctly about the preservation, disposal, or documentation of medication. So your chiefs have a lot of work to do with their officers, and the Chiefs Association is a really good resource, and so I would recommend that you touch base with them and track their training for your officers, because you're going to need them. So that's the Dr. Glock section of our new laws for local law enforcement officers, but there are more. There's now the Sexual Assault Incident Procedure Act. which is effective now in 2017. These are new requirements concerning how we handle sexual assault and sexual abuse crimes. The biggest one is there's a mandatory report that has to be done. I'll share a story with you. When I first began working in municipal law, I went to a chief on an issue, and I said, "Well, where are the notes? Where's the report?" And he told me, "Son, what report? What notes? I'll remember what I need to remember when I need to remember it." And that's a bit of the culture we have now, and that we're up against, and that prompted this legislation. Is now there's a mandatory report to be written. And that takes some training in teaching people how to write reports that don't cause trouble down the road in terms of prosecuting the crime, doesn't open up weaknesses, chinks in our armor for the defense attorneys trying to make an issue where one really shouldn't exist. So we have some training to do around that. The responding officer has a lot of new responsibilities immediately upon doing it. And again, you'll note there, I've listed in the slide, the Chiefs Association has been working very closely with the Attorney General's office on this particular piece of legislation. And there's also a good bulletin at the AG's website, and you can check that out as well. The Attorney General is very interested in making sure that we don't complicate the prosecution of these crimes. This is intended to actually help, but what it means is there's more particular work for our officers on the street who respond to these crimes. We've also got some new work to do in responding to domestic violence issues. They amended that act so that we now have to get some training on how we understand domestic violence victims in working with them to get the evidence. I guess that I'm not sure exactly what prompted this. It's not been clear in looking backwards at the materials and the stuff that did it, but part of the issue has been preventing further victimization of these persons who have been the victims of domestic abuse. It's the classic he said, she said, and so the question is how to respond in a way that doesn't terrify or further victimize the victim. And there's training to be done around that. And it includes, as they develop the training, this is again on the state board for the ISP, as they develop the training, they're supposed to work with community groups. So that one's a little further down the road because the training isn't out and isn't supposed to be out for a little while, but it's coming. And as I said, we've shifted some of the social work to police officers. We've shifted mental health to police officers, and we've shifted physical health to police officers. And we're not even done yet. We've taken away from police officers one of the tools they have. I put NCIS there because whenever I watch that show, the hairs on the back of my neck go up all the time because I go, that's completely illegal. You can't do that. And one of the things they do on that show all the time is ping cell phones and use cell devices as fake cell devices to try and track people. And that's one of the things here now in Illinois that we're prohibited from doing, using a cell site simulator device, except in very limited situations. So one more time that Hollywood has not helped us here with local law enforcement and what it is we can do. Well, you should understand in the background of this is there is developing law around what's called the mosaic theory. It comes out of Washington, D.C., where they tracked a crime where they were able to go backwards and figure out and then put together and trace the perpetrator of the crime from the moment that perpetrator left his neighborhood to convicting the crime as a series of public and private video that they were able to put together as a mosaic. They actually traced this person's timeline, getting to the crime, committing it, and leaving. And one of the objections was that's a little too big brother. That's in violation of the unreasonable searches and seizures because we're always being searched essentially by these video cameras. And where exactly the line is hasn't been determined yet. So, but that's a developing theory, and it's against that background the state of Illinois has now provided this law limiting one of the tools that law enforcement does have or had in the past. Let's see here. Onward to cannabis. Part of the policy in the background for Illinois is we have a huge budget deficit, as everybody knows. And with envy, if you talk to legislators, they look at places like Washington and Colorado that are so flush with dollars from their legalized marijuana that they're actually giving tax rebates. So, against a general background of slowly moving us toward that, probably, one of the first steps was to amend the Cannabis Control Act to make possession of personal amounts no longer a crime. It makes it a civil penalty. You can still have it on your ordinances, both in the county and the municipality. You can make it a local violation, but it's no longer a state crime for these personal amounts. We also have a duty now to go back and look at our records and expunge certain drug-related records. You're actually supposed to have done that once already, and now you got to do it again. Coming up, it's twice annually. So if you haven't caused your folks to do a records expungement, you need to do that, because that's one of the things that's supposed to be done. And speaking of expungement, we've also included more records that are supposed to be expunged. And typically what happens is that this directive isn't really to the municipalities, it's to the courts, but the courts always ask you, it comes back to you for your consent. They always want to ask. And so now people can ask to petition for expungement a lot more often, so you're going to get a lot more of this paperwork. So one of your deputies or somebody in the support staff for your police department is going to be seeing a lot more of these requests to expunge records, particularly around cannabis. The police, the one happy thing I want to end with for law enforcement is a little happier one. Believe it or not, it wasn't easy when a police dog retired to have it just go with its handler. Even though they'd been through, harrowing experiences, this was one of the things they weren't able to do. We had to wait workarounds under the municipal code or under the county code. Now it's the state law that the dog can go with its handler, and if the handler doesn't want it, then they can offer it to any other police officer. And the worst case scenario where nobody wants the dog, it goes to a no-kill shelter, because I guess there were a couple of canines who had served well that ended up in a shelter and were euthanized. So that ends that. But this is a happier thing because in most cases the handlers do want to take the dogs home to serve out their days, and this makes that a lot easier. So one happier note for our friends. New laws in the workplace where you, the municipality or the county or the local unit of government, are the employer. These are laws for those sorts of things. The most important is the new travel expense reimbursement policy. This is what passes for reform in Springfield, is this act. Because clearly this was abused by a couple of people on, the famous junkets. And so now there's all sorts of reform around this. You must have a policy. Hopefully you've all adopted one already. But if not, you need to get on it. And what's supposed to be in the policy is set forth in the statute. The types of business for which they are allowed, the maximum allowable. And it doesn't have to be the GSA number, which is incredibly low. It can be as big a number as you're willing to live with. And some people make it clear that it can be per day or per event. And you've got to factor in airfare for some of you to get to places, for national conferences and so forth. So all that being said, that's supposed to be in there. You're supposed to have a form that's officially adopted as part of your policy. So one of the things you'll need is to create a form and approve that as part of the policy. And the form has to have certain things on here. This is a nod to the Henry County Watchdogs and some of the other watchdog groups who are going to FOIA these things, and they want to have this information readily available in one certain place and not have to tease it out of a whole bunch of different things. And so the form is a nod to them to help us provide the information in a form they can readily and quickly see. And the approval has to be done. Now there's a process around approving this, and one of them is requiring a roll call vote. Well, if you use consent agenda for the warrant every month or every meeting, And that, as you know, is a roll call vote. That satisfies it. All that you need to do is to make sure the warrant spells out the travel expenses by person. So if it says, for example, Laura Brown, these were her travel expenses for this day, and it had the number listed. Laura Brown, U of I event, and this number, and that's on the warrant, and that warrant's approved by roll call, that's sufficient. You don't have to approve the warrant, then approve the travel expenses separately from that. But it does need to be approved by a roll call at an open meeting. And then there's a prohibition. We don't, it's a good thing that Barnum and Bailey is closing the circus, because Illinois has prohibited us from traveling to the circus on any sort of tax dollar. So that timing worked out for us. But it also means no shows, amusements, or more importantly, sporting events can ever show up as a reimbursement or an entertainment expense, in part because they don't think there's any reason for any unit of government to entertain anyone. Now this is not the same thing as, programs that townships or park districts sometimes run, where they take participants to see a theater production. That's perfectly acceptable still. That's a program, not an entertainment expense. So I don't mean to suggest that that's overreached in that way. But travel is the biggest thing in the workplace that you've got to come up with, and it particularly applies to the elected officials for each of our units of government. They're now on this as well. They have to either be pre-approved in an open meeting, or they have to get the expenses approved again and called out specially as well. So those of you who have elected officials that attend some of the state and national conferences need to be paying particular attention, because the FOIA requests are already written and will be coming your way. We also amended a couple of leave things for the 2017 year. Sick leave is one of the things that's been amended by the state of Illinois. Now it's expanded to a spectrum of family members is the takeaway here. So I may not be sick, but if my kid is sick, I can use my sick leave to go home and take care of my kid. You can build a policy around this where you can say no more than half of an employee's sick days can be used for the extended family. It's a very broad spectrum. You see it there in the bottom of the slide. It's child, spouse, sibling, parent, mother-in-law, father-in-law, grandchild, grandparent, or step-parent. And that would apply to, the partner as well. So it's a very broad spectrum. And in talking to some folks, they're probably going to put the no more than half for the family and half for you. But sick leave, they get to use that. If you don't provide sick leave now, you don't have to under this. But if you do, then the benefit is modified this way. And it doesn't extend the amount of sick leave, and it doesn't affect any of the FMLA calculations. So your HR person is going to take a couple of aspirin, sit down and figure out and track all of these different uses of leave, because they're all running independent of themselves and not coordinated in that way. The other leave that they've taken up is the Victims Economic Security and Safety Act. It's for a very small set of employers. It's we're not sure why it is, but there are many units of government who fit in this group. Between 2 and 14 employees. So we at Ansel Glink, we have a number of small park districts, a number of townships that have this number of employees, and it fits to them. And so if there's domestic or sexual violence, there's some leave now automatically granted in those employment situations for those folks. Wage transparency. This is about the retirement spiking, so-called, and with our pensions in the local government world being under attack politically, from everything from TV commercials to speeches given by state elected officials as trying to rein in the budget deficit. People are taking up retirement sooner than later to try and lock in their rights, and no one can blame them for that. That being said, then the wage transparency says if you're getting ready to retire in the next 12 months, there are some new restrictions on the sizes of the increases and how public this process has to be. And so they did that. And then the Open Meetings Act is also amended here to say where you used to be able to go in and talk about what compensation you're going to give this retiring person as an exception to the Open Meetings Act, that exemption is no longer applicable. So when it comes to retirees, you got to talk about that in open space. Social media. I'm watching my time here, so I'm speeding up a little bit. Freedom from Local Surveillance Act means you can't demand any of these things from your employees when you're a unit of government. To make them a friend on Facebook so that you can look at their Facebook page or see what they're doing during their working day or off time. There are restrictions around what we can demand from people about their use of social media. Construction and public works, there's a new amendment to the Illinois Environmental Barriers Act. I know Mark's going to talk about some of the things that are coming with the ADA as well, but Illinois is trying to get closer to mirroring the ADA, and this is going to apply to you guys when you're now finally touching things that haven't been in compliance. You're going to have to speed up in terms of getting your stuff together. Two last things. One, those of you who have any trails or bike paths or scenic ways, you need to understand that there's a new understanding out there in the Illinois court system. This isn't legislation, but these three cases all came sort of rather 1, 2, 3 as gut punches to us here in 2016, so they're effective going forward in 2017. It's these three cases talking about a long scenic pathway along Lake Michigan, a Park District trail, and a bike path. And what they've all said is that essentially where we used to think of trails, paths, and scenic ways as being recreational and we didn't have to spend a lot of care on them, we now need to treat them with more care than we treat sidewalks. We have to pay attention to all of the hazards these things could present. So the Chicago Park District case was about a bike that got caught in a rut on the trail, and that they said that there's no immunity from liability for the rut in the trail because it's not a wilderness trail. It was a scenic way, and the immunity only applies to horse trails out in primitive wilderness, whatever that might be. In the Highland Park case, a tree fell and injured a woman. A limb of a tree. It wasn't even the whole tree. And they said, well, no, the units of government aren't immune from that because the tree is really not part of the trail, so they should have been paying attention to the dead trees along the trail. And therefore, they're not immune from liability for any injuries if, in fact, they failed to take action they should have taken. And then the Forest Preserve District of Will County case, they said that because the Forest Preserve District had properly trained people on how to do this, the fact that somebody deviated from their training and caused a pileup of bicyclists during this bicycle event, they would be immune from that. But they looked at it and said, essentially, you need to be doing safety training now for volunteers who are running events like marathons and trails, which is a new duty because we used to think we were immune. So any of you with trails or bike paths or scenic ways in your inventory of things to do, you now have a lot more to do in order to protect yourself, and you might want to revisit your insurance. Lastly, government consolidation for me. In 2016, we added to the power that was given to DuPage County. DuPage County had the power to go out and consolidate as many as 13 different types of units of government, subject to a backdoor referendum and some other things. In the 2016 session, they gave that power to Lake and McHenry counties going forward. They can start ordering the consolidation of people if they wish, and I think McHenry's already getting ready to do that. Their new county board chairman is Jack Franks, who was a big consolidation proponent in Springfield. And lastly, Senate Bill 3, presently pending in Springfield, would give this power to every county to order the consolidation of local units of government. So this is a wave, and you need to pay attention to it. You need to read the statute. The statute for the counties where it's in the county code itself. It's 55 ILCS 5/5 44010. That's where DuPage, McHenry, and Lake are now. That's where they got the powers to do this. Again, it's 44010 of the county's code, and it's important because DuPage County's already out there ordering the consolidation of them. McHenry's next, and if Senate Bill 3 gets through, and I know that the governor would like to see it get through, every county will have the right to try and start consolidating units of government. So that's mine, and I'm done with a minute to spare, I think.
Very good. We did have one question that popped up while you were presenting, Dirk, if you want to take that now.
Sure.
If you see that in the chat space, they were asking, they had heard that a home rule government was exempt from the travel policy that you described.
That's true. But that's, the minority of people.
So. That was quick. All right. So let me give Chris's introduction and we can move forward. Chris, if you want to take over as presenter.
Hey, this is Chris. The presentation just disappeared from my screen.
Okay, well, let's load that up again.
There it is. I got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Taking over.
All right. Very good. So I'm going to give a brief introduction as you advance the slides to, okay, here we are ready to start. So we've got Chris Marklin is with the National Association of Counties, and he's the Associate Legislative Director for Public Lands. And he also is the Western Interstate Region Liaison. Chris Marklin is a native of Madera County in California's San Joaquin Valley and is a graduate of California State University at Fresno. Prior to joining NACO, he served as a legislative director for a congressman in California. And as the legislative director, he oversaw day-to-day legislative operations of the Office of Public Lands, Energy, Natural Resources, and Environmental Issue Portfolios. Congressman's work on the California drought and his service to the House Appropriation Committee helped to inform extensively Chris's work in the legislative process, which makes him a perfect resource for today's discussion. Chris?
Great. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me today, for giving some time out of your day to chat with you a little bit about what's going on here in Washington, D.C. I wanted to take an opportunity because so much has happened between the election and today to talk a little bit about sort of what we've seen with the swearing in of the new Congress, some of the priorities that we've already seen our federal leaders laying out, and what NACO is prioritizing coming into 2017. So with that, we'll just talk a little bit about the Article 1 of the Constitution, the first branch of government listed out there, the United States Congress. The 115th Congress was sworn in on January 3rd, 2017, bringing in 62 new members into the House and Senate. Not a particularly large class, but not a particularly small class either, kind of right in the middle, but I think what is notable is that although it was a decently sized class, it did not really change the composition of the Congress all that much. 114th Congress showed the Republicans coming in with a 54-seat majority. 115th Congress gives them 52-seat majority in the Senate. In the House, 246 Republican seat majority in the 114th, and 241 seats majority in the 115th. Certainly that is interesting that the Republicans saw a decrease in their respective majorities in the chambers, given the fact that the Republicans ultimately did take the White House. Typically you see those things go hand in hand. Republican administrations bring in Republican members of Congress, and Democratic administrations bring in Democratic members. So this was an interesting flip. Of particular note to counties, there will be 85 former county officials serving in the U.S. Congress. 14 new county officials coming into the House of Representatives and 3 coming into the Senate. It's always great when we see our county leaders stepping up onto the federal stage. We certainly look forward to working with them, and many of them become vital allies to us. So it's something that we're always looking at, something that's, I think, interesting. I think as you're looking at the Senate and House majorities, one of the things that becomes apparent is that although the majority, especially in the House of Representatives for the Republicans, is a relatively strong majority, 218 members needed to to keep a majority to pass a bill through the House. 241 reps is certainly a good buffer above that 218. But if you start slicing that down a little bit, what you notice is that there's one particular organization within the majority that is going to have outsized authority, outsized influence as the conversations play forward, and that is the House Freedom Caucus. 38 members are currently sort of projected as members of the House Freedom Caucus. They don't keep an official membership roster, so that's always sort of a moving target, but 38 members of the House this year have personally identified themselves as members of the Freedom Caucus. If you were to knock out that 38 members, all of a sudden that 241-seat majority becomes a minority. What that means is that the Freedom Caucus is going to be a very influential part, especially of the House of Representatives. If they make the determination to walk away, to not support an initiative, the votes just aren't there. The new leader of the Freedom Caucus, Congressman Mark Meadows from North Carolina, has already shown his ability to flex his muscles there in the House. He was active in orchestrating the activities that ultimately led to Speaker John Boehner resigning his post as Speaker of the House and bringing in Paul Ryan. So he's already shown that he has already shown an ability to organize his members, and the Freedom Caucus as a whole has already shown its ability to influence those activities. So look for them to certainly play a role in shaping a lot of the legislative activities that come forward. One of the other things that I threw up here that I thought was just sort of interesting, given some of the conversation around our president-elect coming in with very little in terms of public elected experience. Many have noted that there is a tension in Washington, D.C. Because our president-elect is coming in and is flouting many of the customs and pageantry and sort of all of those things, the trappings that come with the office of the president that are done by custom and have been done for a long time. Certainly that has created some tension between Washington establishment and the president-elect, but I think it's really interesting to note that if you look at our Congress as a whole, has really also is fairly new to town. 2/3 of the House of Representatives has served for less than 10 years. 75% of the Senate has served for less than 10 years, right? And nearly half of those chambers has served for less than 5. So, although you may hear a lot in the news about the president-elect choosing to overlook some of those sort of protocols and customs, the reality is most of our federal leaders are relatively new and may not place that same sort of value on those customs as some of the longer-serving, more entrenched members of our federal policymakers. So, with that being said, it still remains to be seen how that plays out. But I think it's fair to say that most of Washington, most of those who will be leading our policy discussions over the next, certainly over the next 2 years with the 115th Congress and over the next 4 are relatively new to Washington and to the Washington establishment. So I guess that begs the question: what are our policymakers going to be focusing on? And I want to turn first to the United States Senate because that question is the easiest to answer. The Senate's going to be focusing on presidential appointments. And although the Constitution lays it out fairly straightforward, the president nominates the person. The Senate provides advice and consent, and then that person moves into their position. It's not quite so easy. This chart here kind of lays out exactly the process that goes forward, and more interestingly, I think all the different ways that these nominations can find hiccups along the way. Needless to be said, it's a process with many steps that begins with the president nominating an individual through hearings, through votes, both in the committee and on the floor of the Senate, and finally then moving into their position. A lot of ways that a nominee can run into roadblocks and occasionally find themselves being replaced by other nominees. Very, very rarely, if ever, does it get to the point where a vote on the floor prevents someone from moving into a position. But certainly certainly not a cut and dry process, and the Senate's going to be spending a lot of time on that. There are 21 cabinet level officials that will all need a hearing and votes in the Senate. Every member of the President's cabinet, with the exception of the White House Chief of Staff, is confirmed by the United States Senate. And aside from that, there are more than 1,200 Senate-confirmed appointments that the Senate can constitutionally provide advice and consent over. So although that doesn't usually mean a public hearing for those individuals, certainly there are staff right now working around the clock, burning the midnight oil, going through all of the disclosure documents, records of previous public statements, all of those items that a presidential appointee has to provide, and really going through those with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that there's nothing in there that may be problematic to the appointment. So with that being said, that certainly takes a lot of staff power, a lot of manpower, and really from now, certainly through the middle of February, that's going to be where a lot of the Senate's focus is. But certainly there's legislating to be done, there's policy to be made, and certainly those conversations will also need to be going on. I think what you'll see is most folks driving the bus on the initial policy discussions will be in the House of Representatives. Oh, I've missed one of my own slides. Apologies. This is just a list of all the folks who are going to be who require Senate confirmation or can be confirmed by the Senate and the various committees that have them. So you can see that everyone gets a little piece of the pie, and certainly there are a lot of there's certainly a lot of positions that could be brought up on Capitol Hill in one of those hearings. Flipping over to the House of Representatives, they are going to be driving the bus on a lot of the policy that's being discussed in the first 100 days. That's for a couple of reasons. As I mentioned, the House of Representatives has a more dynamic majority in a number of ways. It's also just easier to move legislation through the House. So if you need to send up a test balloon, if you need to write if you need to write a bill and see if you can get majority support on that, the House is the place to do that. What is the House going to be focusing on? Well, we can look to one document in particular that lays out where the focus of the House majority will be, and that's Paul Ryan's Better Way agenda. It really breaks down into 6 different aspects: the economy, things aspects like regulating smarter, creating jobs, those sorts of items, national security, protecting the homeland. They also note free enterprise as a part of the of their national security agenda, free enterprise including trade and those sorts of items. I think that dovetails with some of the trade rhetoric and action items that President-elect Trump has laid out as a part of his 100 days vision. Tax reform is an item that is particularly important to counties. So we'll go into some of the county legislative priorities going forward and talk a little more about some of those items. But although the overarching goal from Speaker Ryan and from the House Republican majority is to simplify and make for a fairer tax code, this is always a tricky conversation, because what is fair to one person is someone else's earmark or kickback. Things like the homeowners tax credit, research and development tax credit, charitable tax deduction, tax exempt status of municipal bonds, tax exemption for local and state sales tax. All of those have a strong constituency. Certainly counties care very, very deeply about things like being able to write off your state and local taxes, being able to write off the tax exempt status of municipal bonds. And there will be a lot of folks in the room who will be trying to influence that decision. So, but that being said, there is also historical precedent to say that if tax reform is going to move, it's going to move in the first 100 days of a new presidency. We saw that back in we've seen that back over the last 3 major tax reform proposals that have moved through Congress. It's all moved in the first 100 days, and certainly someone like Speaker Ryan, with background running the Ways and Means Committee and previously as actually a staffer here on the Hill working in tax writing positions, is poised to move that, but more remains to be seen. On the healthcare front, that is another significant aspect that counties are going to be looking at very deeply. Certainly the rhetoric that we have heard most strongly from both the President-elect and from both House and Senate majority is repealing Obamacare. That has been outlined as the first priority for both chambers and the President, and something that they want to see, that the President-elect Trump says he wants to see move very quickly. Again, this is a very large package, touches a number of policy aspects, everything from Medicare and Medicaid to insurance policy, doctors' reimbursements, and certainly has wide-ranging impacts on the American public. So I think you're seeing a lot more caution from House and Senate leaders in wanting to make sure that the proposal they put out is done correctly, or is at least done in their perspective in a way that is politically palatable and doesn't leave them in a bad position. So we'll touch a little bit on some of the healthcare aspects going forward, but just flagging that one there. Another item that's been laid out: cures and treatments. Right, when House Republicans took over in 1994, we saw a significant increase in funding for folks like the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, both in basic research and in that infrastructure to deal with health issues on the ground. Counties are, as we like to think about it, counties are the CDC's ground troops. When those sorts of issues break out, it's counties that are responding first. So there's certainly a positive side for that conversation. Increased investment, and certainly the CDC could have a direct and positive impact for counties. The next priority, the Constitution, making a government that's more accountable, more representative, and restoring checks and balances on spending and creating a more transparent federal government. Something that that we have been involved in already at the policy front recently. NACO, the Western Governors Association, our Western Interstate Region, and National Governors Association, and several other policy organizations representing state and local governments joined together in sending a letter to the President-elect, essentially asking to be brought into the room and to work with him to improve the ability of the state and the federal government to work together. Certainly, I think that's always a goal that we as local governments and advocates of local government are pushing. Certainly something we can always, I think, agree on, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, is state and local governments. And the federal government should be able to work together. We should be able to get through our respective jurisdictional hurdles and actually work positively for our common constituencies. So certainly with each new administration, there is a renewed conversation about how to improve those lines of communication and that intergovernmental partnership, and something I think we've seen renewed as a part of this new government. And last is the issue of poverty. The House Republicans laid out a couple of issues here: rewarding work, improving skills in schools. That includes investment in things like trade schools, as well as higher education and K-12 education, and saving for the future and retirement. Again, a direct dovetail back to that potential tax reform conversation is promoting retirement savings and how to best do that for the American worker. All of these, again, this document was put out in June of 2016. Certainly provided a framework, but did not have very little specific legislation attached to it. We'll now see the meat get put on those bones in the days ahead. But certainly, I think the framework for where Speaker Ryan and the House will be looking to go in the coming days and weeks. Now flipping over to the President-elect. President-elect Donald Trump, his campaign was certainly a campaign that was conducted at the 30,000-foot level. Although there were certainly proposals and goals that were set. Many of them were much more conceptual in nature, and very few sort of dense policy memos or direct legislative proposals were put out by the president's team in the days leading up to the election. As the transition team has taken shape, you're starting to see those conversations come out, and again more meat on the bones, but still the focus for them has been on getting their appointments in place, getting their leadership in place to start driving those substantive policy conversations. One document that was put out over the campaign that did provide some guidance into where the president-elect would be looking is his contract with the American voter. You can see I've thrown it up on the screen here, but it really breaks down into three buckets, if you will. One, we heard the phrase over and over again, drain the swamp, and that leads off the list. He outlined 6 measures to clean up what he refers to as corruption and special interests in Washington, D.C. A couple of items of note. Congressional term limits. That's something that he pushed quite a bit on the campaign trail, something that has fairly high a fairly high level of positive reception from the average American voter, but something, frankly, that would require an act of Congress to implement. Speaker Ryan, Majority Leader McConnell have both come out and said that congressional term limits were not something that they saw focusing their time on over the first 100 days. I think it's fair to say that that is, at the very least, still a very open negotiation between the President and Congress, but certainly asking Congress to vote themselves out of their respective elective offices is a difficult lift and one that does not stand a great likelihood of moving forward. Next one, federal hiring freeze. Again, something that is easier said than done. The federal workforce has reduced somewhat in size over the last several years as budgetary realities within the federal government have taken their toll, and as positions have been left unfilled through attrition and retirement. But the president has said that he will implement a federal hiring freeze. This is something, of course, that has a direct impact on county governments. The federal government is a significant employer in many counties and states, and so that can have a direct impact on local economies as hiring freezes go in, positions get left unfilled, and those jobs disappear not only from Washington D.C. But also from communities across the United States. Something we'll all certainly be watching for. Something that could have local effects, and not just in Washington D.C. Another item of note that President-elect Trump has put out is his proposal to repeal 2 regulations for every new one that gets put into effect. Again, something that is an interesting proposal to say the least, but maybe easier said than done, because repealing a regulation takes the same amount of work, same amount of time, same amount of procedures as implementing a regulation. For those of you who have engaged on the regulatory front before, there are multiple comment periods. There is the opportunity for the public to weigh in. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of documents produced by the federal agency in support of their proposal. And then finally, you have a judicial review process that often takes place, usually implemented by through a citizen lawsuit from an impacted party. And all of those items have to play out before a regulation can be implemented or before a regulation can be repealed. So the idea, whether or not he wants to actually tie new regulations that he as president wants to put in to his ability to repeal 2 regulations, or whether that is just more of a goal that he will set for himself in a very conceptual sense, remains to be seen. But it certainly, because county governments are both regulators and the regulated, something that we will be watching closely, because regardless of whether you are repealing regulations or implementing new ones, there will be direct impact on county stakeholders. The next priority set out, protecting the American worker. These are things like renegotiating NAFTA and pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, things that he has discussed on the campaign trail, trade issues across the board, lifting restrictions on oil, coal, and natural gas production in the United States. Is another item that he's included under there, and then canceling UN payments, and then interestingly enough, using those as a pay for, as an offset to reinvest in water and environmental infrastructure. Counties are certainly the owners and operators of significant amounts of infrastructure across the United States, and so that could be viewed as a part of the president's larger infrastructure investment package that he's talked about. And could have positive impacts for counties. We'll touch on that a little bit more when we get down to the NACO section. Finally, restoring the security and the rule of law. Two items that certainly have been a hot topic on the campaign trail, have continued to be a part of the president-elect's rhetoric, is appointing an individual to the Supreme Court to fill the vacancy left by the death of Antonin Scalia. Early in 2016, Majority Leader McConnell came to the NACO Legislative Conference here in Washington, D.C., which takes place each February, and was one of the first public places where he laid out his plan to not fill the seat that was vacated by Justice Scalia's death. It was at the time something that I think everyone was interested to see if he could actually pull that off. As it turns out, they were able to rebuff President Obama's appointment and to hold the line against a lot of political pressure, good, bad, or otherwise. Here we are a year later with a Supreme Court appointment, Supreme Court vacancy, and President-elect Trump with that opportunity. Again, Supreme Court nominees were a very difficult appointment to get across the finish line. And so I think you can look for Senate Democrats to hold a very similar line to what Majority Leader McConnell held over the last year. There is still a very open negotiation on who that appointee may be or what that appointment process may look like. And then also illegal immigration. We've all heard the rhetoric about building the wall, but that will certainly include a lot more than that as President Obama leaves office with several presidential actions in place, including things like deferred action for Dreamers, and other items like that. So all that to be said, that is a very rough framework that is perhaps the best document, most concise document now, laying out the president's 100 days framework, and certainly more to be said, more to be seen as the president is sworn in tomorrow and brings his people into the office, into his offices tomorrow and over the coming week. So what is NACO going to be working on? So our 2017 legislative priorities were adopted by our board of directors in December of 2016, and it really lays out 8 priorities. I'm running up against my time, so I will just hit on a few of them. 1, protecting the tax-exempt status of municipal bonds. This is a big deal for counties across the United States. The majority of tax-exempt bonds finance things like schools, hospitals, roads, public infrastructure, things that are positively supported across the United States. And 75% of our nation's infrastructure projects broadly are completed using municipal bonds. That's $3 trillion since 2003. So real deal issue. This allows counties to bond for the projects that they need to keep their infrastructure moving forward, keep their communities going, and it allows investors to get those at a reduced interest rate. It allows investors to purchase those bonds at a reduced interest rate, gives counties lower interest payments on the back end, gives investors the opportunity to write off some of those the muni bond costs on their books. We really view it as a win-win, but certainly with something like tax reform on the table, this is something that counties across the country are going to need to be paying close attention to. as this conversation plays out. Another item of note, certainly as a part of the healthcare conversation, protecting the federal, state, local partnership for Medicaid. Annually, counties are putting over $83 billion into community health and hospital services, and support nearly 1,000 hospitals and another near 1,000 nursing homes. It's 750 behavioral health authorities, and there are 1,944 local health departments across the United States. Something like reforming Medicaid or moving it to a block grant could ultimately have the result of shifting care for those who are most vulnerable and most in need to the county books and off of the federal books. That's not a win for anybody, as counties will have to do even more with scarce resources, and could negatively impact the standard of care across the board. So something that we want to work to make sure that federal, state, local partnership maintains, and that counties are getting the resources from the federal government, from their federal partners, to care for our shared constituency back home. Another item, just real quick, service transportation priorities. 46% of all roads, 38% of all bridges, and a third of all the nation's airports are operated by county governments. So certainly as the President-elect begins to speak about his infrastructure investment package, we're all watching with great anticipation for what that may be. Initial conversations show that it may be something less like the stimulus package that we saw passed earlier in the 2000s, and instead be something that focuses more on public-private partnerships, but certainly counties, as a major shareholder in our nation's infrastructure, will be looking closely at what that may look like and how we all can work together to reinvest in our nation's infrastructure. So I think with that being said, like I said, we have 8 priorities, but I will hit those top 3, and I'm happy to take questions about the other 5 with the time we have left.
Thanks, Chris. So the other part of your slides that will be shared have contact names for National Association of County Legislative Leaders. Is that correct? So we'll be emailing those out to participants?
Yeah, that's correct. Thank you for that prompt. The last slide that I think we moved past kind of quickly does have the contact information for all of the folks on our legislative team. We've got a team of 13 legislative professionals here who all handle various issues portfolios, and are happy to assist any of our counties across the nation, all 3,069 of you, in answering any legislative questions or providing any support we can for your advocacy activities.
Thank you. So we did have one other question in the chat space that I wanted to give Derek a chance to respond to, and maybe as Derek is responding, if others have a couple of questions, we can stay on for a few minutes and try to answer those. Derek, there was a question from Union County about consolidation and how does it apply to, which units of local government does that apply to? Can you respond to that?
Sure. The pilot program that they're giving the counties power to consolidate are any of the units of government to which the county board chairman appoints the majority of that governing board, and it's with the advice and consent of the county board. Typically, that applies to a few park districts across the state, a few forest preserve districts across the state, a number of water districts, a couple of drainage districts here and there, and what are commonly referred to as paper fire districts, where the fire districts don't actually have any employees. They outsource it to the local municipality. But the governing board members of the paper fire district are appointed by the county chairman. Famously, mosquito abatement districts are one of these. So it's all these kinds of special districts. We have to stay within our constitutional silos a little bit in Illinois, and so it's the ones where the county board chairman has the power of appointment over the board. He can simply eliminate that unit of government and then consolidate those powers and assets along with duties into the county itself.
Terrific. Thank you for that. We will be sending out the slides to everyone who had registered for this program today, and we want to thank both of our presenters for some very insightful and thought-provoking information here in terms of how it affects local government at the community level. So we really appreciate you taking time to share your expertise with us. And you will find at the end of the slides, you'll find contact information for each of our presenters if you want to follow up with additional questions. We're going to close today's session with just a reminder. These webinars are being offered throughout the spring, and our next session will take a look at energy conservation investment measures that can be taken at the local government level, and that will be presented on Thursday, February the 16th. So thanks again to our presenters, and thanks to all of you for joining us for today's webinar.